This is River Raid 2, released in 1988 for the Atari 2600 video computer system, and it's a sequel to the 1982 Activision classic River Raid. Whereas the original was designed by Carol Shaw, the sequel was conceived by David Lubar, and because it's a different designer and programmer, and because it was released 6 years after the original incarnation, River Raid 2 builds on the foundation of the original and feels like a different game that's a little deeper, a little more involved, and perhaps a little less intuitive. But I'm kinda jumping the gun here, so let's backtrack a bit. Now, if you've never played River Raid, first of all, I hate you. Second of all, you're going to burn in hell. There's just no way around it. But in any event, you fly a little plane down a river and you blow up tankers, choppers, bridges, and other planes while occasionally making sure to refuel your own plane by passing through the fuel barges. It was a fun and challenging little title that was easy to get into and difficult to conquer, or some other cliche you'd like to toss in there. River Raid 2 sort of follows this premise, but adds a couple extra bits to the mix to make the gameplay a little more, let's say, involved. That's a nice word for it. When you start a new round, you'll be on this aircraft carrier. You hold down the button to give your jet some thrust and pull the joystick back to lift off. That last bit is important because if you don't do this, you will die. From there, the game sort of plays like River Raid, where you blast red planes and black helicopters while flying over golden planes to refuel. But River Raid 2 now adds altitude to the mix. Suffice it to say, the higher you are, the slower you'll fly. The faster you fly, the lower you are, and the more likely you are to collide with the terrain and the carriers below when you eventually reach the river you're supposed to raid. Now we're in familiar territory. Raid the river, kill the planes, blow up houses and other camps when in high altitude, pick up fuel buoys by flying in at low altitudes, and eventually destroy the bridge with your torpedoes. Yeah, see, your regular shots that you shoot by pressing the button alone will only take out airborne enemies. To take out ground targets, such as enemy carriers and bridges, you need to hold the stick back and then press the button to launch your torpedoes, which will also blow up said bridge. It's a way to get around the limit of the one-button joystick, but it also makes it very easy to shoot torpedoes by accident when all you really want to do is shoot down planes while pulling back. So once you've raided a river, torpedoed a bridge, and fend off another wave of enemies, you'll eventually have to perform the incomparable task of landing the plane on your aircraft carrier. Obviously the bane of many NES gamers. However, unlike in Top Gun, this is actually a bit easier. You just position your plane over the carrier and then pull the stick forward until you come to a dead stop, at which point whatever fuel you have left over gets converted into bonus points and you move on to the next wave where you get to do the whole thing over again. If you fail to land the plane, that's okay, you'll be able to try again as long as you still have fuel left in the tank. But if you run out of fuel, you're dead. It goes without saying. So River Raid 2 is a bit more complex than its predecessor, and for those approaching this for the first time completely blind, it might seem a bit intimidating. Maybe a bit frustrating because the learning curve here is considerable. There's quite a bit of stuff you need to know in order to play a semi-competent, let alone a good session of River Raid 2 compared to the original game. Keep your altitude high so you can fly over terrain, fly in low to pick up fuel buoys, which are few and rare. God knows how long it took me to figure out that I had torpedoes to take out ground targets, including that bridge that I keep crashing into, and I never knew why because I kept firing and it should blow up and it didn't, and flip this gosh darn game. However, once you eventually get the hang of the controls and the gameplay quirks, River Raid 2 does start to feel somewhat playable and possibly even conquerable. But that does not make it a walk in the park. Unlike River Raid, enemies shoot back. Also, unlike River Raid, enemies appear at random. The terrain and position of the target doesn't change, but enemies and fuel tanks do each time you play, so that makes it a bit more difficult to plan your attack because of the randomization factor. It does give River Raid 2 an added layer of depth and challenge that some would argue River Raid lacked, but at the same time it loses the pick up and play intuitiveness that made River Raid an enjoyable experience. Which isn't to say that River Raid 2 isn't fun. Once you get a good groove going, there's a good time to be had here. You just have to work at it a little harder and adjust your style a little bit to get there. Much like in the original game, River Raid 2 only has 2 modes of play, 1-player or 2-player alternating play. The difficulty switches determines whether you can guide your shots as they move upwards or whether your shots move straight ahead. I personally prefer the latter because I can fire my shots and forget about it. while moving on to something else. But that's just me, your mileage may vary. Like I said before, River Raid 2 came out in 1988, and by this point, the few folks still making games for the VCS were able to get some better quality visuals out of the old wood-grained wonder. While River Raid 2 feels like a step above River Raid 1 in some respects, in other respects it's almost on par with the original classic. Some of the craft look a little more refined, and some of the buildings are decent looking enough, but other vehicles like the battleships look like single-colored globs, and the terrain still feels blocky and unnatural, which is to be expected given the hardware. It's presented a little better with all the gauges on the bottom, but no better or worse looking than the previous raid. It's almost a matter of some things looking better and some not, and some looking more or less the same. Sound-wise, it's about as good as you'd expect. Lots of white noise denoting jet noises, ticks and crashes depicting shots fired and explosions, that sort of thing. Still no music, not much else, it sounds fine, about as good as River Raid 1 I guess, not much else to say here. Overall, River Raid 2 is a solid little shooter that takes the simple mechanics of the original 1983 classic and adds to it with a bunch of doohickeys and gimmicks that makes it a much more intricate game than its predecessor. The additions of altitude, different shots for different targets, and having to lift off and touch down from the carrier certainly adds to the depth and challenge of River Raid 2, although it'll take a few tries to get a good groove going. When all is said and done, I personally prefer the simpler and more straightforward experience of the original River Raid, but River Raid 2 is certainly a decent offering on its own merits, and definitely one worth checking out if you get the chance.